Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Give Atlas a Break When Shouldering Responsibility for Information Governance is Too Heavy for a Human. I'm Sean Magali, Director of Content at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's event. With me today from AIIM is Peggy Winton, and from Iron Mountain we have Steve Lester and Kelly Matoney. Iron Mountain is the underwriter of today's webinar. We thank them for their support, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. Before we get started, let me share a few tips for participating in today's webinar. By joining live, you can resize the windows in front of you, open group chat to message with each other and with us. Please say hello and share where you're joining us from. Download the resources we have for you. They'll open up in a new browser tab, so click on them now and you can check them out after the webinar. I encourage you to ask questions of the speakers with the Q&A feature. We'll do our best to get to them all later in the webcast. Later, please take the survey found in the icons across the bottom of your screen. We truly value your feedback on how we did today. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to AIM.org's Resources Webinars page in a few days. Now to introduce today's speakers. Peggy Winton, President of AIIM. With over 30 years of program, product, and business development experience, Peggy Winton is responsible for the strategic, technical, and business direction of AIIM. Peggy believes that marketing and technology are converging and moving to the forefront of the business in order to deliver the ultimate customer experience. With this, businesses need to adapt to a world that has shifted from physical to data, technology, and automation. Kelly Matoney is a principal and practice leader in Iron Mountain's Information Governance and Digital Solutions Professional Services Group. She has over 15 years of experience leading large-scale and transformative privacy, compliance, and risk management initiatives in the public and private sectors. Kelly is a licensed attorney with an MBA and CIPM and CIPP certifications. Stephen E. Lester is a corporate counsel manager with Iron Mountain's global compliance team. Mr. Lester counsels the business on a variety of corporate compliance topics, including code of ethics, sales and marketing compliance, privacy and data breach, incident response, and Latin America privacy. He is a certified compliance and ethics professional and a member of the Massachusetts Bar. Now to turn things over to Peggy Winton to begin our talk today.
Well, thank you, Sean. And man, I'm in really good company with Kelly and Steve today. So really looking forward to our conversation about key business drivers around information governance as told to us by you guys, by our extensive AIM community. And we're going to try to apply some real-life context through the examples that are provided by Iron Mountain and their customers. In all of this, the operative word really is automation. You know, we do a lot of research, and information governance is part of that research. It's actually one of 4 key digital transformation aspirations that we identified and talked about almost 4 years ago. And automating information governance is one of our domains of knowledge in AIM's own certified information professional book of knowledge. It's that important. So what I'm going to share with you over the next several minutes are the results presented and collated from over 300 of your peers. When we ask you what's driving this, what obstacles are standing in your way, that's what we're going to talk about today. And then talk about, well, how do we get beyond those kinds of obstacles and those challenges? And what's really happening out in the marketplace? I dare say you'll hear some things that might sound a lot like your organization, and we'll try to provide different examples in different verticals and in different roles functionally. But one data point we've been measuring and reporting on for a few years is really worth repeating here because it answers the why question today. Why are we talking about automating governance? It's because the volume the velocity and the variety of information that most organizations need to manage and store and protect, it now exceeds their ability to even marginally keep pace with big content. You've got to be feeling that too. And when we regularly ask our AIM communities about that volume and the expected growth over the next 2 years, they tell us on average that they expect it to grow by almost 5 times. That's huge. Not even Atlas could bear that kind of weight. And if that weren't challenging enough, they expect that nearly 60% of that volume, that information, to be unstructured, like a contract or a conversation, or even semi-structured, the kind of thing you'd find on an invoice or a form. So this is a good time, Steve, to ask you, why is the unstructured aspect of this information growth so important? Why is it worth talking about?
Thanks, Peggy. Yeah, it's really great to be with you and the AIM participants today. And you're right, unstructured data really does expose companies in a number of ways. So let's talk about a few of them. First off, if the data is unstructured, you can't effectively categorize it according to its risk. So therefore, it becomes difficult to stack the appropriate resources against it to protect it. For example, do you know if it's health information, financial information, perhaps customer profile information, or even if it's not personal data at all? And because you don't know precisely or even generally what it is, the tendency is to either overprotect it or conversely to underprotect it, both of which carry a great deal of risk. So to dive a little deeper, if you overprotect the data, you may not be able to use it appropriately to derive value from that data to achieve your business goals. And on the other hand, if you underprotect it, you may expose it to hacking or data breach. So by not knowing what it is, there is that tendency to bucket it in a certain way, and then you end up not applying the right resources around it. So another risk there in terms of uncategorized data is in terms of not being able to adequately respond to a data privacy request. As we all know, over the last several years, there have been a number of new data privacy laws that have come onto the books, such as the CCPA. We know about the GDPR, and there are others coming down the pike. And those require a complete response. And that response could be in the form of data contained in an image, or as you mentioned, perhaps in a conversation that's minuted or a chat record. So you're required to provide a complete response, and it doesn't really matter under the law whether that data is uncategorized. The laws also don't provide you with much time to respond. So once you receive a request under one of these laws, the clock starts, and that is not the time to start categorizing your data. And finally, another risk involved in unstructured data relates to your contracts. You may not be able to be in a position to assess your key contract terms and conditions, for example, those concerning liability or pricing. So you may be put in a position where you aren't sure of your exposure in the event of something like a contract breach, or you may not know if you can legally raise your prices or automatically renew your contracts. So basically, uncategorized data can expose you in several important ways.
I really like that, that we're trying to reach that happy medium, because you're quite right. If you overprotect things, and a lot of organizations are doing that, Steve, when it comes to GDPR and CCPA, they're so afraid of the responsibility of that personal data that they're like, no, we don't want it. But as you say, if doing that that means they're really missing an opportunity to derive and extract those value nuggets. So that's a good point. I'm gonna park that one. Don't overprotect it. Don't underprotect it. And as you know, in many organizations, the workers are the ones that are encouraged or expected or required to do that identifying and capturing of their own information. Well, that's an additional challenge in effective information management because these users have other business responsibilities that take precedent. I mean, we're all trying to do more with less. So no wonder they're viewing information management as administrative overhead or busy work that they'd really rather not do. And even if they did, they just aren't adequately trained. I think that puts everyone in a really difficult position. It's a question of they don't have enough time, they don't really have enough interest, and they certainly don't have enough expertise. Kelly, why don't you give us some examples of some daily functions where this might actually be the case?
I'd be happy to, Peggy, and thanks again for having Steve and I here today with you today. Certainly, there are many examples of daily functions where employees are generating and augmenting data in unstructured or semi-structured ways. For example, customer service and sales interactions, which would include emails or notes placed on a customer's account for calls or with respect to research being performed on the customer's behalf. You have support tickets. It could also include such things as chat interactions or social media exchanges. And in some cases, it may include audio or video recordings, both from a customer servicing and product perspective. And this is probably the largest collection of information that represents the greatest risk, but also the greatest opportunity to gain value from your data. The next group of functions really center around marketing and supplier exchanges. And although some of the data in these exchanges is structured, oftentimes it's semi-structured or unstructured. And this quite often is the case when contracts with third parties are complex and contain lots of details. And we also see this in the emails and documents and other exchanges that take place when an issue arises. And organizations are working with these third parties to address them and bring them to closure. And lastly, an often overlooked area, particularly for suppliers and service providers, manufacturers, and R&D companies, is all of the market and product research that's being done. There are a lot of opportunities to better manage this data, to both protect it and also to derive better value from the information collected.
It's interesting that all of those scenarios that you just highlighted really refer to frontline and customer-facing people. And again, that's where the value is. That's where executives want to put as many resources as possible. Those people have higher ulterior motives than being asked to tag and categorize. So no wonder that's an undue risk there. So thank you for those examples. Here's what AIIM's research shows as some of the risks that occur when there's a lack of governance practices compounded when those things aren't automated. And the top responses you told us is loss of customer confidence or bad publicity from data loss. Again, notice the customer word in there. Steve mentioned regulatory action from loss and exposure of personal identifying information. And finally, loss of intellectual property or company confidential information. Steve, all of these risks are really related. Can you walk us through some possible solutions to overcome them?
Sure, I would be happy to. So yes, they're definitely interrelated, and in my opinion, all of them come as a result of not properly governing information, and then, as we talked about, applying the appropriate controls and safeguards to protect that information. And this is consistent across all types of important data, whether it's personal data, company confidential data, or your business's intellectual property and trade secrets. So certainly a data breach involving your customers or your employees' personal data is the most consequential of these risks, but I believe they're all significant. So let's talk about the solutions. My suggestion is that you take a layered approach involving both automated and manual controls. So what does that mean exactly? As we've heard, the greatest impact and return on your investment will be from applying automated controls to your policies and your systems, where data is classified at the entry point or upon creation. Now that's the most evolved state to be in, but admittedly most companies are still on their journey. So unfortunately, Atlas still has some lifting to do here. So let's talk a little bit about the manual side. Much of the legwork around data governance falls to the employees who either generate the data or handle the data as part of their day-to-day jobs. So arming them with the tools and information they need to properly classify and govern that data is crucial to mitigating these risks. So here are some examples. Employees should be able to recognize what personal data is. And I know it sounds simple to us, but a lot of the times it's not so simple. Employees should also be able to recognize the company's non-public information. So do they know what's been published externally, or do they know what needs to be held secret to the company? So target that training to specific roles and keep the guidance short and actionable. For example, here's something we can all do. Train your HR teams to always password protect spreadsheets containing employee personal data. Another thing you can do is train your customer teams to restrict access to shared drives which contain customer data. So between automated controls and manual controls, you'll be able to effectively mitigate these risks.
I like that. I'm parking a few other things that you just said. I like that. Target that training to specific roles and keep it short and actionable. To expect otherwise is just not realistic. So thanks for that, Kelly and Steve. The risks aren't just really about data breaches or noncompliance with regulations. When workers are tasked with these activities, they're taken away from higher value work. That seems to be a theme that we're hearing throughout just what the few data points we've shared. And to be effective, organizations really have to embrace that approach of streamline, whether that's some of the manual but very actionable and understandable manual activities to take place, and automate. Governance compliance tasks really need to be automated to the maximum extent possible so that information management and records management are seamlessly occurring without that need for worker intervention. And you all said that. You absolutely agreed that was the case. Kelly, what are some of the tactical benefits of doing that? We're going to talk about strategic and functional sort of benefits, but what are some of the tactical benefits of automating information governance?
Well, Peggy, you're absolutely right when you say that organizations must streamline and automate information governance to the extent possible. And that's especially true to mitigate risks, like the risks of data breaches and fines, as well as to comply with applicable regulations. In addition to those benefits, automating information governance enables organizations to derive more value from their information. And as you indicated, it also allows their employees to concentrate on the quality and the efficiency of the task at hand without having to detract or distract focus from that task. Automating information governance can also help reduce the cost of responding to discovery requests and Freedom of Information Act or FOIA requests by enabling organizations to find records more quickly and to identify them more accurately.
The longer-term strategic benefits, as we're seeing, are moving beyond that simple storage or infrastructure cost reduction as a primary driver. That's what you would have told us 5 years ago. Now you're much more concerned with understanding that link between information governance and customer experiences. And I should stop and say customer experience, that need to anticipate and meet customer expectations, is the #1 digital transformation aspiration that we identified. And we see that even in the middle of this pandemic where necessity always wins out, it is faster. How do I get what customers need as quickly as possible? So that has been a key trend over the last 5 years, just that simple desire to reduce storage and infrastructure costs to really making that strategic connection between information governance and an improved customer experience. That's not always easy to do. And the current top benefits of that are faster response to events like accidents, press activities, as Kelly said, FOIA inquiries, better customer and supplier relationships. 38% of you said that. And finally, more personal and accurate service to customers. That is an emerging criteria right now. So Kelly, again, give us examples of industries and cases where these kind of bigger picture and customer-facing benefits are being realized.
Thanks, Peggy. Sorry about that. I was on mute. As you mentioned, good information governance provides a wealth of benefits for both the organizations that implement it and their customers and clients. So chief among them are the ability to respond to incidents and data breaches more quickly, which can help organizations mitigate the cost of a breach and enable them to notify regulators and comply with short notification timeframes. It also enables organizations to quickly identify which individuals were impacted and how they were impacted. We already talked about how good information governance can enable organizations to respond more quickly to data subject or privacy requests. Because in order to fulfill these types of requests, you really need to know what data you have, where it's located in various repositories and systems, and if it's shared with third parties. Because some of them might also need to take action to fulfill the request, which requires knowing where that information is housed. And there could be fines or penalties involved if you don't complete the consumer privacy request in the required timeframes, such as 30 days under GDPR in Europe or 45 days for California consumers. And good information governance can also help you manage your third-party risks and better manage those relationships. Most organizations have third-party risk management policies and practices in place, but it's important to think about how they're actually executed and managed, which is why many organizations are implementing more comprehensive solutions that enable their organization to manage the relationship throughout its entire life cycle, from onboarding vendors to conducting risk-based control assessments, contract management, and also vendor workflows, notifications, and escalations. Managing the third-party life cycle in a more structured and systematized and centralized way can help an organization reduce risks, proactively identify issues, and maximize the value of their third-party relationships. And lastly, good information governance supports good data analytics. It helps improve the accuracy of the data being collected and how it's used, and it enables your organization to place the appropriate controls around the data used for analysis to prevent unauthorized disclosures and data breaches. It also enables you to help gain better insights from your data to help make better business decisions and improve products and services for customers. And I did want to circle back with, a few examples. So I know we had talked a lot about data subject or data privacy requests. In terms of automating information governance, it's really helpful to include certain compliance requirements within the process flow, again, going to that automation facet. So in such cases with the data privacy requests, knowing the policy and requirements for how long you must retain a record enables you to respond more quickly and compliantly to these requests. Meaning if a customer were to ask for a record to be deleted under a privacy law, such as GDPR, you'll want to make sure the person processing the request in your organization knows right away whether the record can be deleted or must be retained due to another regulatory requirement. And having this information readily available and embedded into the response process really enables your organization to respond more quickly and more accurately to the request.
Great examples, thank you. And again, of course they're responding to all those inquiries, but I'm so glad that you mentioned the third-party vendor risk, because the importance of supply chain in all of this that we're going through right now has just really bubbled up to the top. And I think a lot of times we view our information governance policies and practices just in an insular sort of way. Well, when you open up to your value chains and your supply chains, things like paper forms you send out are definitely going to come back and haunt you. And you don't want to pin that responsibility on anybody. It's going to simply hold up progress and that necessity that's so important right now. So Steve and Kelly, we talked about some of the business and the operational objectives in automating our governance activities. Now let's talk about how to set some rules and rationale for ensuring that those objectives are met. Not many people get too excited about policy, but the internal policy environment that surrounds information governance and the ability for most organizations to automate the consistency with their own policy is becoming an increasingly important arena. So we're seeing that many organizations are actually focusing their efforts on these three elements or components of policy. 61% of you said that it's that access. Who's got access? And confidentiality. How do you do a rules or roles-based access to ensure that? Data protection and personal information. We've cited that across a few different points here. And finally, information retention at about 56%. So Steve, why do you think that these three elements in particular rank so highly on this much longer list?
Yeah, I'm not really surprised, Peggy, that these are the highest ranking elements for inclusion in a data governance policy. So I'd urge everyone to pull back the lens a little bit and think about your marketplace and your stakeholders. So in my opinion, faith in the marketplace and ultimately your business success derives in great part from building trust with all of your stakeholders, whether it's your customers, your employees, your regulators, your shareholders, or indeed your community. So each of the three elements that AIIM members identified in the survey has a direct impact on each of these groups of stakeholders. And to be clear, we don't want that impact to be negative, we want it to be positive. So, for example, when you're storing vast amounts of personal data belonging to either your customers or your employees, you need to be able to produce it in full, update it, or delete it when it's no longer needed or no longer subject to legal retention requirements. And as Kelly mentioned, this includes your third parties. As it relates to your shareholders, let's say your company's developed an industry breakthrough or it's working on a major acquisition. It's essential that you keep that a secret until it's disclosed to your shareholders to avoid the risk of insider trading. And then, as it relates to your community, perhaps you're gathering data for a report on your company's corporate social responsibility efforts. So you need access to the most accurate and up-to-date facts and figures, because if you make mistakes, your community will lose faith. So for all of these situations, and many more, appropriately managed information will get you where you need to be in the most efficient way possible. And that's why it's important to take these elements into consideration when building or training on your information governance policy.
Trust is a pretty important word in all of this. We've done some work at AIIM with a brand strategist who says that as a community. We've lost our faith in our religious leaders. We've lost our faith in our elected officials. But we're now looking to brands and to those companies with which we work for trust and loyalty. So I think you're hitting a really important point that up to now has somewhat been overlooked. So, the reality is that just because you put a policy out there doesn't mean that it's going to be effective. It doesn't mean that people are going to follow it. So let's talk about some of the obstacles or challenges in creating a policy to begin with, and then talk about how we can resolve those challenges and up the compliance of the policy, so to speak. Kelly, can you walk us through each of the top 4 challenges that are presented here and describe some possible solutions?
Sure. Well, let's start with the first challenge, which is having the right people at the table. Information governance is something that needs to be done at the enterprise level, and sets the overall strategy for information governance in an organization. So naturally, it requires engagement from stakeholders across the enterprise, and it's important to have the right people at the table. To be successful, it's critical to have executive support. Given the size and scope of the effort and likely the dollar value of investment required, it's important to have the executives buy in and have agreement on the strategy, and make sure that the organization is ready to support the progress needed to strengthen information governance practices, which would ordinarily include listing it as a strategic goal for the organization with key metrics and objectives. It's also important to delegate decision-making authority to those responsible for executing and implementing the strategy with clearly established roles and responsibilities. So you need buy-in from these decision makers, and you can help this process by answering the question, what's in it for me, for them. So for example, enabling compliance without breaking the business, or increasing the efficiency of a process to reduce costs and improve customer satisfaction. The main point being that it's important for leaders of different business units and areas to understand that the executive team considers this transformation journey a priority, and that there is, in fact, value to them by helping to support and enable it in their area of the organization. And of course, strengthening and automating information governance is a large undertaking. So structuring and setting up tiers of support along the way will help dramatically, and especially as you look to implement policies at the workflow or the process level. Another challenge most organizations face is enforcing information governance policy once it's been developed, or really being able to apply the policy to actual content. And this is where compliance engines and automation are key to being able to build compliance rules, controls, and retention in a sustainable and a manageable way. And there are a lot of such tools on the market, and certainly at Iron Mountain we have our own products and partners that we work with as appropriate. But when considering the different compliance and automation tools, it's important to assess their capabilities and functionality, as well as how those capabilities align with your business and your information governance needs. It's also to consider how well or if the platform can interface with other applications used within your organization. Some platforms focus on certain areas of risk, like managing the third-party risk lifecycle or privacy management, or perhaps you might be using a content services platform to manage your processes and workflows. But the policy and compliance components have to be provided from some external source, meaning that you'll have to figure out how you're going to manage and maintain those rules to share them with the CSP. Or consider acquiring another product that helps you manage those rules and then connect the two platforms to apply the rules to your content and workflows. So it's important to really understand and analyze how or if you can easily share information across platforms when purchasing a tool to help automate your information governance within your organization. Another big challenge for organizations is identifying and monitoring regulatory changes and then updating and implementing them across the enterprise. And this has become a huge and daunting task for many organizations, and particularly right now in our current environment. For example, in the United States, 4 states have enacted their own privacy laws, and there's another 16 states that have bills pending, as well as Congress. Plus, there are also changes occurring around the globe, like in Brazil and Canada and many other countries. Added to that, organizations are also facing challenges related to COVID-19. And this is especially true as employers begin to reopen around the world. And many regulators and data protection authorities have issued guidance pertaining to the collection, use, and disclosure of COVID-19 related data. And updates to these guidelines are happening all the time. And the requirements vary by country and oftentimes by state as well. So the pace and the frequency of updates, especially in today's environment, really requires a more systematic and automated way to help you monitor and respond to the changing regulations and guidance. And that's really why leveraging compliance technologies and policy engines really has become so important. And then lastly, after an organization has identified all of its legal requirements or regulatory changes, it needs to have the capability to respond quickly and implement the changes. And the most effective way to do this is to automate the changes to the extent possible. This includes leveraging the compliance and policy engines that we just discussed, and then hopefully applying the changes directly to the workflows and processes that have compliance requirements already built into them. It's also helpful to automate, to the extent possible, content classification to help facilitate compliance and mitigate risks. So, for example, being able to automatically tag and classify COVID-19 related records will help you apply the new guidelines and rules to the records, and also to quickly identify the records, which, for example, you might need to know if someone files a COVID-19 related claim, since special rules may ultimately apply if the government or individual states, as they're considering limiting liability for such claims. So having the appropriate policies are important and a foundational step, but also operationalizing the policies is also critical from both a compliance and a risk management perspective. And just as another example, at Iron Mountain, we help clients manage and update very comprehensive retention policies for their organizations. And the way we structure retention policies and rules really lends itself to the automation that you discussed earlier, so that as clients build and update and expand their use of workflows and content services platforms, they can apply retention rules to the records and documents that they're creating. So we're able to build in and embed these requirements into multiple scenarios, including addressing situations like triggering events and addressing legal holds that may apply. So this enables customers to automatically delete data after retention requirements have been met, or in cases where clients are hesitant to delete information automatically, which is not an uncommon scenario, they can send the records or documents that are eligible for destruction to a team member or someone else to review and verify before the data is disposed of. And so, again, looking for opportunities to automate these governance practices will really help you mitigate risks and strengthen compliance in your organization.
Really good point that it's certainly not information governance for information governance sake, and it's not sitting there in a vacuum. Hey, let's do information governance. That's not the business, clearly. And to the extent that it is agile and it can change along with continually changing workflows is important. That's a really good point to make, Kelly, particularly now. All right, so it's time for a little self-assessment. We've pulled together a few points, and not meant to be a downer, but maybe a way to realistically look at your own information governance programs. And hate to say it, but it's probably lacking if any of these following are true. Are you keeping information beyond its usefulness to your organization? Kelly just mentioned there is such a hesitancy to hit the delete button. We all know that. We've seen it in email for years and years. I always like to use the analogy of a closet at home. Show me a just unclean email box, and I'll show you a closet that still has a polyester leisure suit hanging in it. You probably don't need that one anymore unless you're doing dress-ups. Do inquiries take too long? Particularly today, we've said necessity is fueling a need for faster and better responses from our constituents, from our customers, from our communities. Does your organization store too much rot? And you all know what that is by now. Is it information that's redundant? Is it obsolete, or is it trivial? Get rid of it. Is there uncertainty as to whether a particular document is the correct version, the most up-to-date version, or just a copy? Clearly, this is not only an information governance compliance risk, but it's pretty inefficient. How much time do we all spend just looking for the information we need in order to do our job and just not sure which version of a pretty critical document is the correct one? Two more. Is information or information-related systems, are there any that just seem to have no specific owner? Oh, you know that takes place. Or in some cases, there are multiple owners, so nobody's really taking charge. Always good to ask, I think, three questions. Whose job is it anyway? Does anybody really care? And will this ever get done? And that's a hard set of questions, but ask those. And finally, is the use of personal devices uncontrolled or ungoverned? We've certainly seen that now as workers are being sent home for the first time for many people with consumer-grade tools or the trust that they're going to keep a personal device safe. Really important to set new rules around that. So Kelly, happily, there is some advice. There's proven advice and considerations that you guys at Iron Mountain have seen. You've seen it among your customers, and you've got them. We're going to help our good audience take some of these for overcoming these shortfalls and really getting started in building what would be considered a world-class information governance program, sort of step by step. And I think you've got 4 steps you want to present here.
Yes, Peggy, that was a great overview of many of the gaps and holes in most organizations' IG programs. From our perspective, we strongly encourage our clients to begin by building their foundation. And the best way to begin is typically by performing a holistic enterprise information governance assessment. This enables you to baseline your program, establish priorities, easily identify risks, and measure your progress going forward. As Steve mentioned, information governance is a journey that we're going to be continually on for the indefinite future. So understanding where you're at in the journey and where you're trying to go is key to your success. In terms of more discrete actions you can take to strengthen information governance, certainly a key foundational step is to find out what data you have, what processing activities you perform with it, and with whom it's shared, as well as classifying it to the extent possible, which we've already talked about is best done at the point of collection. In terms of understanding where the data flows in your systems, this is where data mapping can be extremely helpful, as it allows you to see visually where the data is collected, stored, and shared both inside and outside of your organization. Strengthening information governance is an ongoing and incremental process. So consider focusing efforts on high-risk and high-value activities or quick wins. This enables you to demonstrate progress and keep the momentum throughout your information governance journey. And then lastly, it's important to dispose of data in accordance with retention rules, as you said, to get rid of the polyester suit or get rid of the rot. In this case, you'll be able to reduce your risk of a data breach. And as you indicated, in most cases, this data is older and just outdated and presents significantly more risk than actual value to the organization. And Steve, I believe you had a few ideas that you wanted to share as well.
Great, thanks, Kelly. For me, privacy and data governance is not just about protecting the data, it's about respecting the data and the people whose personal data you're handling. So consider that every piece of information that you collect and use, there's somebody whose health and well-being depends upon how you handle that data at every stage of its life cycle, whether it's collection, use, through on to secure destruction. So when you're doing this, consider the human element as well. And to that end, technology is key to properly governing the data. So we talked earlier about a layered approach where Atlas still plays a role. But whenever possible, take the human element out of the equation, or at least minimize it, and leverage technology instead. It's an investment, but I would urge you to make that investment because it's a sound one. And finally, don't be concerned about asking questions both within your company and outside of your company. If you have a corporate records manager, ask him or her. Your company's privacy lawyer or even your general counsel are both great resources to approach. You can also reach out to AIIM or to a company like Iron Mountain, which can help bolster your company's in-house expertise. Speaking personally from my perspective, doing this for Iron Mountain, I love to get questions, and especially from people I've never met before. So my recommendation would be to go for it. The experts are there to help, and they want to help.
Well, speaking of questions, we're about ready to move on to questions, but I want to remind everyone that you should avail yourself of these wonderful resources Iron Mountain is making available, and that's all available here from your console. That includes an infographic based on some of the information governance results that we've done, research that we've done, and Iron Mountain has been a very loyal underwriter of that, and we really, really appreciate it. While we get to the questions, let me answer one really quickly that someone has asked. Will CEUs be awarded for this event and activity? And yes, absolutely. We will show you how to track that if you don't, and we know who you are by that question. So thanks a lot for that, and thanks everyone for your attention. So very, very interesting questions. One is all about forming that team. What is the right way to do that? Brianna asked, do you see teams creating a full information governance team sort of on their own? I think that's what you're asking. Or leveraging stakeholders in other already established teams to drive that work. I know what AIIM would recommend in this regard, but Steve or Kelly, would you like to take that one? I think what Brianna is asking is there a standalone IG team, or do you involve stakeholders that might represent departmental or functional teams? Who wants to take that one?
Sure. I'd be happy to take that, Peggy. Certainly, it's important to have somebody, running point for the effort. But and I believe you'd agree, Peggy, that it's important to include stakeholder representation across the enterprise, because information governance, to be most effectively implemented, really needs to be done at an enterprise level and with the appropriate stakeholders engaged throughout the process.
Yeah, I would.
I think.
With that,
I was just going to add that Kelly made such an important connection between workflows and processes. Well, who better than the process owners and line of business owners to be part of that, because they understand the processes, and most of those are customer facing.
That's absolutely right, Peggy.
Sorry, Steve.
Oh, not
Steve,
at all.
What else would you like to add?
So I think information that comes into companies gets generated from a lot of sources. It's collected directly from customers or consumers, perhaps your business partners, your vendors, et cetera. So that information then flows to a number of different teams within your company for appropriate business use. It could be to vet a vendor, to approve a candidate for employment, to sell a product or service, et cetera. So you really do need to push out your training and your knowledge around information governance to every department that either collects or uses this type of information. In fact, it's going to be hard to find a department that does not use it. So I think there does indeed need to be central leadership on it, but I think the goal is a shared one across the entire enterprise.
The next question is actually asked in a somewhat different way by two of our audience members. Sam is asking, how do you implement data governance for big data? And Deborah is saying, I'm really curious about what everyone's doing for data retention versus, say, document or records retention. Do you align the two? Data is often kept longer to support business analytics and can often be dynamic. What would you say to that, Kelly or Steve?
So I think from a privacy regulation perspective, the responses that you're required to provide under the CCPA or the GDPR, for example, are with regard to the data. So you want to be able to provide people with the data, the personal data that you hold about them. So you don't necessarily need to provide the entire document or the record that may contain that data. Essentially, you need to provide an accounting of the data itself, and then if there's a need to correct it, delete it, et cetera, that's your obligation with regard to the data. So I see that as somewhat distinct to retaining records, which you may need to do for example, a litigation hold or for another data retention schedule purpose, et cetera. Kelly, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I agree with your comments, Steve. The only thing I'd add to that is certainly the retention rules generally apply at a record level, or also in some cases at a document level. So being able to identify what records the data is a part of is really going to be instrumental in determining what retention rule you should apply. And again, being able to embed that into the workflow or process that utilizes those records is ideal, so that you can make sure you're complying with the retention requirements and taking the appropriate actions, whether it's responding to a data deletion request or some kind of other privacy request or other requests for information, that you're taking the appropriate actions and in compliance with the rules that govern the records for that particular subset of data.
There are probably lots of new examples of data coming in because of our sad situation, be it virus or some of the violence. And this audience member is asking, are you at Iron Mountain seeing anything as it relates to law enforcement body camera video? Or do you have any recommendations for managing what must be really large volumes of data now coming in from that source and maybe related sources? Steve or Kelly?
I think from the perspective of the data, generally it is unstructured data. So I think in general what type of data it is, right? You know the source, you know approximately what the scope of the data is in the case of, for example, a law enforcement body cam, a video or things of that nature, but you don't really know what the contents are specifically. So it does make it difficult, and I think categorizing it on the intake, right, with metadata or other information that can make it searchable down the road, or using artificial intelligence, something like the Iron Mountain Insight product can really help to make that data valuable when you do need it down the road.
That's so true, and I think another key component of that is, the context in which that video is being used, right? So whether it's law enforcement or a lot of private organizations use video as well to monitor consumers or employees and things like that. So just making sure you understand the compliance rules associated with the collection and use and sharing of that data is also very important.
That's great. Eric has been very patient, and this is probably a good last question to take. And that relates to Iron Mountain's own tools and services. What tools or services do you offer for automating information governance or classification? Can you give a sort of quick highlight of those tools?
Sure. Well, we have a host of internally developed solutions. We have our Insight platform, which is our AI machine learning platform and content services platform that we can use to help customers classify their content and really perform in-depth analyses that otherwise wouldn't be possible in more unstructured or semi-structured formats. We also have our Policy Center solution, which enables organizations to monitor and manage retention as well as data compliance rules. And that particular platform does connect through open APIs to other platforms that allows you to share those rules and, again, be able to apply your policies to your content through any workflow solution provider you might be using. Again, we also partner with many different vendors and key performers in different areas to make sure that we deliver the appropriate solution to clients. Every organization is different and has different needs and has different technologies that they're using. So, it's one thing that we feel very strongly about is whether it's our internally developed solution or an external source, really working with them to identify the appropriate tool that best meets their needs and solves their business challenge. Steve, did you have anything to add?
No, I think that covers it.
Well, thank you. And as always, we have more questions than we have time for. We're almost at the top of the hour. One of our audience members asked about whether the presentation would be available. Absolutely. Look at your console. We have all sorts of resources for you there, and this is being recorded. We will make it available to all of you who registered. Maybe some of your colleagues registered and couldn't actually attend. We'll make that available so you can actually have the audio benefit as well. I'd be remiss if I didn't direct you to a few things. We actually have a learning asset on information governance we make available online. So we'd love for you to take advantage of that and do more of a deeper dive. And we happen to be having a summer school sale at this point. So save 40% off of that course or any of the courses that we offer. In the remaining few minutes, I certainly want to thank you, and I know Kelly and Steve join me in doing that. I want to give them 1 minute each to think about some of these questions that have been asked. Have we missed anything? Is there any point that you would like to leave our good audience with? Something we might not have fleshed out very well, or just a new thought that's come to you?
For me, it's to remember to take a layered approach, right? Companies are still on their journey from doing everything manually or perhaps not doing much at all to completely automating their information governance. And so in the interim, while you're still on that journey, remember that although automation is the shiny object at the end of the road, it's still important to not forget the manual processes as well that will bolster that in the meantime.
That's the reality. It's sort of a hybrid world. Often when you look at cloud or on-premises, I think that's a good point that I've noted and parked myself. Thank you, Steve. How about you, Kelly?
To add to what Steve said, given that information governance is a journey and you're making incremental progress over time, I just want to underscore the importance of assessing your program to understand where you are today and making sure everyone's clear and in alignment on where you're trying to go. And to be sure to set yourself up to be able to measure your progress along the way. So again, to the extent that it's feasible, performing an information governance assessment, if you haven't already, or certainly at regular intervals, is really key to being able to really prioritize and best manage and expend your resources in this particular area. And then again, just underscoring the importance of leveraging technology to the extent possible to strengthen compliance and mitigate risks, and really enabling your employees to focus on the more value-added activities to the extent you can, so they don't have to perform these tasks manually.
Great way to wrap up. Thank you all. We will answer questions that might not have been shared out loud, so do not worry. Please take advantage of the recording and all of our other resources, and we hope to see you on another AIM webinar soon. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Kelly, and thanks to the audience. See you next time.